Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to be here. I sped over from Georgetown University. It's our Tropaya Day, and our students are walking across the stage, and we're turning out Africanists, and that's a beautiful thing for me. I come to this perspective on the AU from my position as an anthropologist, a political and economic anthropologist, somebody interested in how Africans have interpreted their relationship with the wider world, especially with the UN, and as someone who is interested in hearing what people have to say about this relationship between the AU and its global partners, such as the UN. And so that's the perspective I'm going to be taking. As a researcher, I've had an opportunity to kind of do a lot of research on Africa over the years, to have many conversations, interviews, conferences with people who worked within the UN, Africans who represented their countries within the UN. And the goal was to see how they assessed the phases of this relationship with the UN. And so I want to kind of outline what I see as several major transition points that have occurred in the OAU-AU relationship with the wider world, particularly with the UN. I want to start with that early period, and I don't think there's any way for us to overestimate the importance of the African Union as a focal point for collective action on the part of African countries. The entry of the African states one by one during the 60s and 70s into the UN gave a greater dynamism to the group of 77, to the newly emerging independent countries within the UN, and began to alter the dynamics of how the UN dealt with the non-West. Now, I said began to alter those dynamics because it was important to realize that the UN in the 60s looked very much like the world of the post-war period. And I've heard many people, Brian Urquhart said, you know, the UN wasn't really designed to deal with the challenges that were facing it, being brought to it by the African countries. And certainly this was a major challenge, and Africa's presence pushed those changes forward. But likewise, I have to say that the participation of Africa with the UN also posed challenges for the development of, for democratic development, for the emergence of mechanisms that would enable African countries to deal both nationally and collectively with the problems that they were facing in the late 60s, the 70s. So I think it's significant for us to remember that the majority of the peace missions that the UN undertook have historically been in Africa. And of course, during the 80s and the 90s, in rapid succession, many of those peace missions came up. One of the impacts of that was that the Africans got to see fairly early the desire of the UN to participate in peacekeeping and all of that, but the inadequacy of the resources that the UN could or would, we can debate this, contribute to the peace enterprise. And so one of the repercussions was the awareness that African countries, that African regional organizations, and that the AU had to further develop its mechanism for conflict resolution. And of course, when the UN could not or would not supply the resources that were needed for conflicts such as Liberia early on, or Sierra Leone, then we saw Nigeria enable ECOWAS through ECOMOG to perform those those peace and conflict resolution duties that had to be performed. This relationship then between UN, AU, sometimes tense, also served to develop the relationships. I'm not saying it was a conscious effort to. I'm saying the repercussion was that Africa developed a lot of internal strengths that would serve it well in the period that followed. The second phase, I think, occurred in the late 1990s as African civil society representatives rallied with their global partners and pushed back against reforming states, states that had gone through the structural adjustment period, states that had been weakened and many people have argued been deindustrialized as a result of that experiment, but states that emerged and struggled toward greater economic growth during this period. Here, the UN played another critical role. I have to say that this is a back and forth. The UNECA, some of you will remember that under Boutros Ghali, we had Professor Adedeji as the executive director of UNECA, and he was an advocate for African initiatives, working with Boutros Ghali on, the Africa Agenda for Peace and Africa Agenda for Development, and pushing the Lagos Plan of Action. But the UN was not at that point open to the kind of dialogue on economic change, on economic reform that Adedeji put forward. We saw under Kofi Annan, as Kofi Annan came in, that's a whole different dialogue, but as Kofi Annan came in as Secretary General, we saw him empower K.Y. Amwako to begin the discussions on the big table talks that took place between the African economic ministers and the African foreign ministers and the European finance and foreign ministers. And out of that, push as they might, grumble as they might, the Africans moved, sometimes hesitatingly, often grumbling, how dare the UN impose on us plans that we did not construct, but they moved in a way that internalized and actually claimed those plans for themselves, so that the outcome, NEPAD, the outcome of that, the Program on African Development, was essentially a major step forward for the continent. I am arguing, now we know that a lot of discussions and competition went on in the shaping and the claiming of NEPAD, but out of it came a major initiative for the continent to move forward. So you have the continent moving forward on the security front, and you have the continent moving forward on the economic front, and governance remains remained the thorny nut to crack. But what has been interesting is that during the second period we saw the important role that women took in this development. Women with their NGOs, women leaders, women mobilizing civil society, women providing a lot of the inspiration that gave a message to civil society that the state must treat us as citizens rather than subjects. And so this second period is a very significant one. I'm going to speed up a little bit, but I think that a third period occurred during Kofi Annan's last term, during that period between 2001 and 2006. And in that period, it was clear that he had acted as a norm entrepreneur, and all those things that he brought Africans to the table grumbling about were and had been internalized to a significant extent. So all of the criticisms at the beginning about the UN using an African to impose upon us global norms had been transformed. And now those norms were increasingly being implemented in the governance strategies. In my interviews with Kofi Annan, I've interviewed a lot of them, so this came to me from a number of corners, but in my interviews, he said, yeah, governance was the thorny one. You know, we didn't really have a clear mandate on how we were supposed to deal with that particular set. And you saw UNDP and to some extent UNECA begin to set the parameters for that. But I think during this last period, the real movement forward that had already occurred was a maturation during this last period. And we saw that within Africa were all kinds of institutions, within South Africa, within Nigeria, within Senegal, all over the continent, African-led institutions that were pushing back against the state on issues of governance, that were supporting African peer review, that were supporting the integration of APRM into the workings of the African Union. And we began to see a closing of the gap between the norms being pushed by the UN and the norms that are being accepted and utilized and operationalized by the AU. So I think this is a period of fluorescence. I am enormously pleased. I think this back and forth has deepened and enriched Africa's capacity to do its own work. And so African solutions for African problems, that notion that was often tossed out to evade responsibilities, financial responsibilities for the work that had to be done, has now been turned around so that Africans themselves have the institutions, have the capacity, have the training, have the bright young people are pushing for the kinds of education and opportunities for these young people that will further grow the institutions of governance for the continent.